Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 114, and welcome to the first of two lectures, which will conclude the second portion of the class. Here in the second portion of the class, we are examining the war itself, the war years. In previous lectures, we've examined the era of Southern ascendance, the politics, meaning, and ultimate policy of emancipation, the idea of a total war. Here, though, we begin a series of lectures, two lectures, where we'll examine the final 2 years of the war, and in doing so, hopefully explain why, despite the fact that the South early in the war is winning the war, despite the fact that Lincoln is forced in a desperate effort to issue the Emancipation Proclamation to try to prevent a Southern victory. In these next two lectures, we hope to explain why, despite that early period of success for the South, beginning in 1863, the tide of the war will shift, and the North will be ascendant. The North will be winning every major battle, and ultimately, in April of 1865, force the South into surrender. So this begins a couple of lectures titled On to Appomattox. We're headed to the Appomattox Courthouse. We're headed to the surrender of the South, and these lectures are designed to explain how that happens. But in addition to illuminating the trends after 1863 that reverse the course of the war, these lectures also will set the stage for the third and final portion of the class, where we will examine the aftermath of the war, the period known as Reconstruction, where America will emerge out of the Civil War with a brand new identity as a post-slavery nation and face the process of reconstructing the nation after this deadly and ruinous Civil War. What we will see in these two lectures is not just the end of the war, but how the end of the war sets the stage for what's often called the war after the war. Reconstruction sets the stage for the debates that will define that period after the Civil War. So we begin this two-part look at the latter stage of the conflict from 1863 to 1865. We hope to illuminate why the tide of the war shifts, but also illuminate how at the end of the Civil War, a number of developments at the end of the war set the stage for indeed the debates after the war in the Reconstruction period. Certainly one factor that plays a role in the defeat of the Confederacy concerns its poor leadership. Jefferson Davis was chosen to be the president of the Confederacy based on his military background, a West Point graduate. He certainly represented the ethos, spirit of the planter elite. He was a wealthy planter. He was part of that group of power brokers in the South. And so he was, again, one of them. He was part of the club of those who supported secession as a member of the planter elite, but also because of his military background, he was envisioned as someone who could advance the interest of slave owners, the interest of secession by winning a war against the North. Again, when Southern states secede, they realize that likely means civil war, and that would mean having a period where they have to fight for their independence so that they could be a separate sovereign nation to preserve and extend slavery. And so Davis was imagined to be the right guy for that job. He was always imagined to be sort of an interim figure, a transitory figure, who would shepherd the South through the inevitable war, but then step aside when the South would gain its independence. So Davis was chosen largely because of his military background. But that meant he didn't have the qualities and characteristics that were necessary to a political consensus figure who could rally the Confederacy during the difficult and trying times that would manifest in the latter stage of the war. So Davis's leadership ultimately becomes a problem, a factor here in the defeat of the South, because when the war goes on longer than either side anticipated, when the war becomes so deadly, ruinous, when it becomes so demanding on the totality of society, Davis's inability to rally the Southern people, urge them to make collective sacrifice, his inability to connect with the non-slaveholding majority would prove to be a true liability. Davis was a wealthy planter. He was in many ways removed from the experience of the men who will fill the ranks of the Confederate Army. He didn't have that ability to relate to common Southerners that Lincoln is able to employ in the North. So Davis made sense as an interim figure based on his military background when secessionists realized secession means civil war. But because he was chosen for his military background and not because of his persuasive, consensus-building political skills, when such skills become necessary, when the war goes on for so long, when you need someone who could rally the Southern people, build a coalition, urge them to make a collective sacrifice, the inability of Davis to do that really will prove to be a liability. So we introduce the factors that ultimately play a role in the South's defeat by, again, addressing one of the many problems that would plague the South, the fact that it had to fight a civil war while also governing itself for the first time. It's a point we made earlier in the class, that the South has this very difficult effort. Secession means we're not part of the United States anymore, we're not governed by the Constitution, we're not governed by Lincoln and his administration. Well, to make good on that, you have to create your own government. And so they're spinning that plate. But to win your independence as a free, separate, sovereign nation, you have to win a war. And so they're spinning that plate. Davis was designed to accomplish the latter, the military victory. But you also have to keep that other plate spinning. And Davis just didn't have the ability, the political skills necessary to maintain a consensus among Southerners, particularly when the war becomes so difficult, taxing, and deadly. Under Jefferson Davis, during a war that would become so demanding, the Confederacy will attempt to consolidate control over the 11 states that form the Confederate States of America. And this will be a big challenge for Davis, because the whole rationale, origin for the Confederacy was a rejection of a centralized authority under Lincoln. When these states secede from the Union, they say, we're not going to be governed by a president that's hostile to our values and our interests, those interests of a slave economy and slave society. So secession, the very existence of the Confederacy, was built on a rejection of a centralized authority who was considered hostile to the interest of these states. But Davis has to consolidate authority and control to enforce a draft, to marshal scarce resources, and we know the South has very scarce resources relative to the North. When the war goes on for so long, it becomes more and more necessary for Davis to have this top-down, heavy-handed role. But in doing so, he goes right against the whole rationale, origin, ideology of the South. So one of the great challenges for Davis was imposing centralized authority over a political movement that originated out of a rejection to centralized authority. This is keenly apparent in the conflict over cotton production. Davis wanted wealthy planters, slaveholders in the Confederacy to stop growing cotton and grow food, because, as we'll talk about in this lecture, food is increasingly scarce in the South. Davis, again, on high, managing this large effort, realizes we need to feed our soldiers, we need to also feed our civilian population, and cut off from northern sources, we need our own sources of foodstuffs. And so, for military strategic reasons, he orders the large growers, the large planters in the South, to shift from cotton production to the cultivation of wheat. How do these planters respond to this? Well, one, they don't like the idea of growing wheat. They like growing cotton. White gold is a great source of profit. And they also don't like being told what to do with their land and their slaves. So here's an example of how Davis has to take action that will raise, irk the sensibilities of Southerners that are at the heart of the Confederacy and secession. Secession was about, we have the right to do what we want with our land and our slaves. That's why these 11 states refused to be governed by Lincoln, who wanted to halt the expansion of the Cotton Empire. So the whole origin of the Confederacy was about the right to own other people, extract from their labor in the pursuit of profit. And here comes Davis saying, I know that's what we're fighting for, but I need you to stop it for a little while and grow wheat. And of course, there was resistance to this. So here's an example of how Davis is trying to govern in a way that will be effective for the exigencies of fighting the war, but one that runs into a collision with the whole ideology and rationale of the Confederacy. And Davis just isn't able to skillfully parse this problem. We mentioned earlier that one of the causal factors in the Emancipation Proclamation, why it happens, is the fear, and it's a very legitimate fear, sustained by the work of historians who've investigated this, the fear that Great Britain would come into the war on the side of the Confederacy if it wasn't a war to end slavery. That's, as we talked about, one of the reasons why Lincoln does make it a war to end slavery, because it prevented Great Britain from entering the conflict on the side of the South, as Great Britain was already committed to abolition in its empire. So that was a causal factor in the Emancipation Proclamation. The failure of Davis to secure Great Britain as an ally would be held against him by planters who realized that if Great Britain had come into the war, they likely would have won. So here's the other side of the point we were making earlier in regards to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln does this to prevent Great Britain from entering the war. Well, that makes sense for Lincoln. It's a success to avoid Great Britain recognizing the Confederacy and potentially aiding the Confederacy. But that means it's a great demerit and loss for Davis. He was accused of failing to use the leverage of the South and its cotton production to bring Great Britain into the war, what was known as King Cotton diplomacy, the way in which the South realized, hey, we've got an advantage here. Great Britain needs our cotton. Its textile industry, its economy is driven by slave-produced cotton. So let's use that leverage to get Great Britain on our side. When that doesn't work, well, who's to blame? And this too draws a divide, a cleavage between Davis and the planter elite. Many Southern governors were hesitant to enforce the draft because they themselves faced reprisals, being targeted, voted out of office for enforcing an unpopular conscription. And so they'll do their best to hem and haw, to delay, to evade active, vigorous enforcement of conscription. We talked earlier about the New York City draft riots and the way in which Lincoln was subject to rebuke and ultimately violent uprisings in rejection of the draft. Draft is not popular in the South, particularly when the war is going on so long and casualty rates are so high. There's a good chance you're going to lose an arm, an eye, a leg, or you're going to die. And so Southern young men weren't any more eager than Northerners to fight in a war that meant such potential. But the South needs people more than the North because they, again, have such a manpower disadvantage. And so Davis, again, from on high, has to command conscription. But there's a lot of resistance to that by those who actually have to enforce it on the ground level because it's not in their interest to enforce this policy. And again, Davis can't use the political skills necessary to get these governors in line, which means an already existing problem for the South, a lack of manpower, becomes even sharper. And this will be important, as we'll see in a moment, in regards to Northern strategies that embrace high casualty rates, the war of attrition employed by Grant and other Union generals. So Davis is in a difficult position. because he has to enforce certain strictures that are necessary to win the war, namely conscription and management of a Southern economy in a way that dissuades production of cotton and emphasizes instead production of less profitable cash crops, foodstuffs like wheat. You got to do that to win a war. You got to feed your army, and you got to have an army. But when he attempts to enforce that on high as president, it runs right into the whole ideology and rationale of the South, which rejected centralized control, which prized individual power over private property, including enslaved people. Many counterfactuals in the Civil War. Again, that's probably why it attracts our historical interest and imagination. What ifs, right? We've had a few already. What if the Union from the very beginning had been much more aggressive? What if, rather than George McClellan, the reluctant warrior, maybe Lincoln had Grant from the beginning, and Grant seizes Richmond in a few months, and the war is over in a few months. It never becomes the major event that it is. It never becomes the event that sparks the end of slavery and arguably the Second American Revolution. So we've already seen that counterfactual, which is interesting to ponder because it really does bring to the fore the importance of the Civil War. Another counterfactual is, what if Lincoln was a Southerner? What if he could lend his remarkable rhetorical skills, his political acumen to the cause of the Confederacy? Maybe the South would have won. What if Davis was the President of the United States rather than the President of the Confederacy? So that question crystallizes for us this issue of Davis's responsibility, culpability in his poor leadership that becomes more of a problem when the war goes on for so long, and you need a leader like Lincoln who can rally the American people, who can balance the various things at stake and manage a heterogeneous population of people who aren't always in favor of his efforts and administration. Lincoln did that really well. It was hard, it was difficult, it was ugly at times, but he did it because he had that ability to relate to a variety of different people, many of whom were opposed to his actions. Davis's personality is very different. He's aloof, he's stubborn, he's committed to this idea, my way is the only way. He said, I'm in charge, and he will try in a heavy-handed fashion to impose a lot of this, and it won't work. And that plays a role ultimately in the defeat of the South, that they didn't have a Lincoln. They instead had a Davis. Another factor in the demise of the South, and this is related, all of these are related to what we said earlier about Davis's poor leadership and what we'll say in a moment about wartime strategies employed by the North. Another factor connected to that, but one we can isolate as very important, is the way in which a Southern solidarity, which we traced earlier in the class, that urged poor non-slaveholding white men to see themselves in league with and solidarity with the planter elite, how that will unravel. Part of this was due to the dogged, determined efforts of enslaved people to be free. We documented in our 2 lectures on emancipation the way in which enslaved people said, I'm not waiting for Lincoln, I'm not waiting for Lincoln to change his mind and make emancipation policy. This is my chance to be a free person. I'm going to head north. I'm going to escape. I'm going to make my way into Union lines with no guarantees. First emancipators, again, are the enslaved themselves. And we talked about how, though, even in the period where the South is winning the war, slavery is imploding from within. And this will urge Southerners to say, what are we fighting for? We might even win, but we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. We can't return to where we were. Because even if we win and have this ability to preserve and extend slavery, how do we exert the power over enslaved people to, again, be subject to a disciplinary control? Many non-slaveholding whites were invested again in slavery. One as an economic proposition. I don't own slaves now, but I want to be able to own slaves. Or as a set of cultural values that define freedom, morality, and the superiority of white men. And for that slavery to be unraveling in the way that we documented earlier, it would really serve to, again, urge non-slaveholding whites to wonder why they were so invested in fighting for something that they personally didn't profit from, and one that seemed to be unraveling from within. Another factor in urging a class divide between the non-slaveholding white men who fill the ranks of the soldiering class and the slaveholders that fill the ranks of the officer class is the war proves to be deadly, brutal. It's not fun. It's not a manly camping trip. Both sides have to countenance this, that there's a good chance you're going to lose an arm, a leg, an eye, or your life. And so when the war goes on for so long, well, there's a potential for, again, urging a class consciousness, where poor white men will wonder, why are we fighting this long, difficult war that likely means my loss of limb or life, when what we're fighting for seems to be so already endangered? And then when the war shifts and the North is winning, and it looks like the North is going to win, why would you continue to fight for what it increasingly seems to be a cause, a goal slipping away? And in the South, where there's, again, such a disadvantage in terms of population, this disaffection is much more acute and therefore consequential in terms of impact. We talked earlier about, well, the North is heterogeneous. The North is a population of people who aren't too keen on fighting for black liberation. You have those draft riots. You have criticism of Lincoln. So we've already documented that the North also has its fissures and divisions, but the North can weather that a little bit better because even with a substantial part of its population opposing the war, the draft, there's still enough Northerners to field an army. South, not the case. When Southerners start to turn against the war, or their class consciousness activates, when they become increasingly convinced that what they're fighting for is evaporating and that they are fighting for the interest of a few at the expense of the many, well, the South isn't able to weather that disaffection because it just doesn't have the numbers on its side. I mentioned this many times throughout the class. There is this law passed by the Confederacy early in the conflict. The language of the law might be offensive to us now, 20 Negro law, so that's not the term I'm using. It's the actual term for this law. And again, it excused Southerners who owned 20 or more slaves from serving. And early in the war, not controversial, not a point of contention. Non-slaveholders, or those who didn't own 20 slaves, accepted this as necessary to control the enslaved population, prevent runaways, and maintain production necessary for the Confederacy. But when the war goes on so long, when slavery is unraveling from within, when the North begins to rack up victories, when the South is enduring high casualty rates, this becomes a major source of contention. Why are we fighting and dying when the people who have things at stake that potentially could profit the ownership of slavery, of slaves, and the maintenance of slavery are excused? So class tensions are increasing. Southerners are increasingly aware of the fact that this is a war where the burdens are unduly, in their mind, falling upon the non-slaveholding class. So what could be smoothed over before the Civil War, the class divisions, maintained by the ethos, spirit, and ideals of that slave society we talked about, well, it can't be smoothed over in 1863, 1864, and early 1865, when non-slaveholding whites become increasingly convinced that they're fighting a war for the interest of that small slaveholding minority, and that they are enduring burdens, physical, psychological, material, that the slaveholding class is excused from. So maintaining solidarity is vital to that slave society, and it's vital to maintaining an effort to fight for that slave society. And it's becoming harder and harder for the South to do that, making this another factor ultimately conspiring against the South after 1863. Another key event in 1863, in the spring of 1863, demonstrates this erosion of solidarities, as well as the poor leadership of Davis. So we can really pull together some threads here in the Southern food riots, or as they're also described, the Southern bread riots of March and April of 1863. Food was scarce because so much had been diverted to armies. Whatever foodstuffs were produced in a southern economy that's still increasingly focused on cotton, diverted to armies. Southern armies often confiscated the food grown on small farms, and so food was scarce. There was a drought in 1862 that meant that less food was produced, and so you had scarcity, and that meant rising prices for basic commodities, bread, milk, butter, and a starving population by early 1863. And as a result, women in many southern cities, Atlanta, Savannah, Richmond, stormed the streets in 1863, smashed the windows of bakeries, storming these businesses to feed themselves and their family because they were starving, because they were unable to pay the exorbitant prices for foodstuffs, basic commodities in scarce supply. So of 1863, summer of 1863 is the year of the New York City draft riots, such a flashpoint event that speaks to the fissures and divides in the North in an era where now the North was fighting for the end of slavery. Months earlier, in the same year of 1863, you have this flashpoint event in southern cities, the Southern Food Riots or Southern Bread Riots, which demonstrate the divides in the South, class divides between the rich and the poor. Here, with poor women unable to feed themselves and their families, desperate, rioting in the cause of basic necessities. So this flashpoint event too, illuminating in a very different way than the flashpoint event of 1863 we encountered earlier in New York City draft riots. Here you have a population of women, men off fighting. They, again, as we talked about in a previous lecture, tasked with maintaining households, farms, feeding themselves and their children, angry that this government, the Confederate government, isn't able to provide even the basic necessities for its population. And that's what I said meant earlier when I said that this event not only speaks to class divisions, deprivations, true acute problems for the South. Why is the South going to lose? Well, part of the reason is that their people are starving. But this event also speaks to the point we made in the very first slides about the failure of Davis. What does Davis do when these women, desperate, starving, storm businesses? He threatens to call out the army and arrest them and suppress this outburst of desperation. He does the worst possible thing. As I said, part of what was motivating these riots, protests, demonstrations was an anger, not just at the fact that bread was so expensive and scarce, but that Davis was so bad at managing an economy that could produce basic foodstuffs. Government is failing us. This government we're supposed to be fighting for, the Confederate States of America. And then that same government responds to your expression of anger by threatening you with incarceration. Davis is doing what? Exercising power from on high. I will call out the militia. I will round up these women and throw them in jail. Well, we've already talked about how Davis exerting power on high is extremely problematic. And now, who's he targeting? Desperate, starving women. Now, tack back to, again, some of the insights we developed in one of our very first lectures about that slave society. And I noted that one of the elements of that slave society, one of those elements of cultural glue that would work to bind together non-slaveholding whites and slaveholding whites, was paternalism. This idea that we are men who are in charge of our households, we are men who have all the rights associated with being a white man, but also all the responsibilities. And we talked a lot in those lectures about how that was an ethos of spirit that all white men could embrace. They could all imagine themselves as these paternal figures caring for their dependents, which in slaveholding families meant slaves, and in non-slaveholding families meant women, children. So that it didn't matter if you owned slaves. You could still see yourself in relation to this paternalistic ideal. Well, when you learn that your wife is starving, your children are starving, that they're forced to storm businesses, break windows just to feed themselves, and that Jefferson Davis is threatening to lock them up, well, that paternalistic ethos activates. And it makes these non-slave-holding white men who think of themselves in that way as good stewards of their home, as protectors of their wives and children, to say, what the hell are we fighting for? So there's a lot here. There's many layers to the Southern food riots and how they speak to, again, problems rife in the South. Here, 2 years into the war in 1863. Let's now talk about some shifts in the war itself. Now, in a previous lecture, we talked about how 1861 through 1862, every major battle is a victory for the South. And it's a victory with high casualties. It's a series of victories marked by mass desertions by Northerners who throw down their rifles. The South is invading the North, even though it doesn't have to. Well, after 1863, that military history shifts. And you see some key turning points in 1863 that open the door to a reversal by which in 1864 it's the North that's winning every major battle. In early July, you have the battle at Gettysburg, where Lee sought to invade the North, realizing again how traumatizing that would be to a North that expected to be winning. And so he gambled on yet another invasion, realizing that if he was successful, it might deal a death blow to the North. And so you get that battle in early July in Gettysburg. Largest battle ever staged in North America. Tens of thousands of troops. Gettysburg isn't a clear victory for the North. Maybe they fought to a truce or a tie. But it could be interpreted as a moral victory because Lee is held back in his invasion. He's not able to force the North into retreat. The Union holds their lines. They suffered extremely high casualties, thousands of deaths, but they didn't budge. And what Gettysburg did was it gave the North something to rally around, that idea of holding the line. And from that, they will build a series of victories going forward. And then in the aftermath of Gettysburg, you have Lincoln giving that address, the Gettysburg Address, which rallies the North, allows them to really envision what isn't a clear victory, isn't a resounding defeat of Lee's army, but they can see it as something bigger, grandiose, a moment to build on, something that could be elevated to a cause worth fighting for. And so again, you have the advantage of Lincoln and his ability to take the great costs, the great deaths, the great miseries that Gettysburg brought and elevate it to a moment where we could build on going forward. And then there's an event at the very end of Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863, that will also be important in the symbolic power of Gettysburg. If it's not a clear, untrammeled, unalloyed military victory, it again could be a moment for symbolism, holding the line, not retreating, a moment that Lincoln will later build on in his Gettysburg Address to great symbolic importance. And then there's an event during the war itself, during the battle itself, that would be symbolically important in undermining the South and its solidarities. Pickett's Charge. This was an order that came from Lee to lead an assault against the Union, where Confederate soldiers were chosen to rise up, run at the enemy, charge. And it was an absolute disaster. Thousands died in just this one incident as part of the larger battle at Gettysburg. And so militarily it was a disaster. Militarily it was costly, this foolish charge and attack on Union lines. But now tack back to the point we made in previous slides about the growing class divisions, where Southerners, as early as 1863, when the war is still largely in their hands, are starting to think about these class divisions between the officer class and the soldiering class. Who are the people who were killed, mowed down in Pickett's charge? They were the poor, non-slave-holding soldiering class. Who was ordered? Who gave the order? The officers. What Pickett's charge seemed to demonstrate was, one, we have poor leadership. And two, we, the poor, non-slave-holding, subsistence farmers, are considered expendable. That the officers who ordered this could be so indifferent to the potential catastrophe and mass death that came with Pickett's charge. So not only was this militarily a disaster, not only is this part of the larger way in which Gettysburg could be desperately held by the Union as a moral victory and something to build on, it was also a catastrophe that keenly, sharply represented a division between the soldiering class and the officer class, a class division between non-slave-holding soldiers and slave-holding officers, who, one, showed poor judgment, poor leadership in ordering such a charge that was disastrous, that saw Confederate soldiers mowed down, but also seemed to indicate an indifference to the lives of these soldiers who are so necessary to maintaining the Confederate efforts. It's been said by some historians that the South psychologically never recovered from Pickett's charge. Then, a day later, there is a clear unalloyed victory at Vicksburg for the Union, where there was mass surrender of the South and consolidation of control of the Mississippi River, which would also be a physical asset to build on as the North will march from the Mississippi through the underbelly of the South towards the Atlantic. So soon after the moral victory of Gettysburg, you have a clear military victory at Vicksburg, meaning that in the summer of 1863, the war was shifting. So let's now enumerate what we've learned in the first few slides here about what's going on in 1863 and how a war that originally was so successful for the South is shifting. And remember, all this plays out in the backdrop of the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863. That meant the North is now fighting to end slavery, and the Northern Army is an army of liberation. We have the poor leadership of the Confederate government. We have increasing divisions within the South. We have the Southern bread riots and the meanings associated with them. And now, the one thing the South could still hold on to, military success, is also reversing. And from Gettysburg and Vicksburg will come a huge shift, where now the North is ascendant. The North is winning every major battle. And it's winning again the cause of black liberation. It's now an army of liberation. And so the one thing the South could still hold on to, its success militarily, was also leaving. And what's that going to do to those other factors we've enunciated? It's only going to undermine Davis more more he's going to be seen as inept. It's only going to aggrandize those divisions along the lines of class. It's only going to further encourage enslaved people to run away with that omnipresent reminder that slavery itself was unraveling. So we can really weave together these threads now to help you understand what's going on by mid-1863 and how it portends for ultimately a great shift in the war. Into 1864, that string of victories. Now Ulysses S. Grant was in command of the Union Army, and he was willing to do what many generals in that role earlier had been unwilling to do: fight aggressively. And Grant ultimately adopts a plan of attrition. He does the math. He says, we got way more people than they do. And if we fight in an aggressive fashion, we're going to lose a lot of men. And that's terrible and bad, but we can absorb it because we have more people. The South can't. This is what's going to end the war. This is what's going to hasten the end of the war. Now, as we'll talk about here, this is a huge gamble. Again, we got hindsight. We sit here in the 21st century and go, well, this is going to work. This is what hastens the end of the war. But in 1863, 1864, 1865, this is a hell of a gamble because they don't have that hindsight. They don't have that confidence. Remember, in 1864, Lincoln has to turn to the American people and say, 4 more years, vote for me. And he has to do that now as a candidate who owns emancipation, as controversial and revolting as that is for many Northerners. He owns the draft, income tax, suspension of habeas corpus, and he is consciously and deliberately fighting in a way that likely means mass death for Northerners, this war of attrition style. So think about that in the context of 1864. This makes sense militarily. It, for the first time, allows the North to take advantage of something they haven't been able to take advantage, the weight of numbers. We have the comfort of hindsight here in the 21st century and go, yeah, it's going to work, and it's going to defeat the South, and with it, end slavery. But it's a hell of a gamble in an election year of 1864, where Grant is willing to fight in a fashion that likely means your son, your husband, is going to die in a period where he's been forced to serve in a now largely conscripted army. You have some victories, though, that for Grant legitimize this and hopefully in the minds of those leading this effort buoy the spirits of a circumspect nation. In 1864, you have a series of victories known as the Battle of Wilderness in northern Virginia, and it really demonstrates in full awareness and vividness the style of a war of attrition, fighting in a way that deliberately means high casualties because the Union can absorb it. Grant fights in this fashion knowing that the South can't maintain this, knowing that this will indeed cause greater psychological trauma to the South, to see the South now pierced and invaded. And also the way in which this will aggrandize those class divisions, where with the South losing so many men, more and more Southern men are convinced, why fight? When they get letters home saying, again, children are starving, why fight? So this really is a moment for you to, again, keep all of these different factors in the soup, in the stew, bubbling together, right? Grant fights in this way not only because he has the weight of numbers on his side, not only because he's convinced it's working. There's, again, proof in now victory, clear victories in 1864, like in the Battle of Wilderness. But he too knows that this is going to undermine morale in the South. But also be mindful of how risky it is, because it is an election year. In 1864, Lincoln has to run, and basically his stewardship of the war is subject to a referendum. Vote for me, you get more of this. George McClellan runs against him and says, vote for me and the war ends. And your son or daughter, your husband, comes home. So that too is in the soup. That too is in the stew. In the course of 6 weeks, the Union lost 60,000 men, 10,000 a week. That was the entire size of the army just under Robert E. Lee's command, the Army of Northern Virginia. In 6 weeks, the Union loses the equivalent of Lee's entire army. And they could do it because they had more people on their side, and they do it because they know this is what's going to end the war. But this will lead Grant to be seen as a butcher. Criticism of Lincoln will intensify. There is no promise that this will work. There's no hindsight in an election year. So it is what many argue the low point of the war. This is where we're at as a nation. A war where thousands, tens of thousands of people are dying every week, on top of the deprivations and miseries that the nation has already endured since the war began in 1861. This war of attrition style would earn Grant the moniker Butcher of Men. Not any moniker any general would want to earn. And this is a term that was used to describe him from the North. Of course, Southerners said even worse things about Grant. But Northerners, Northern newspapers, are representing him as such again in this election year of 1864, where Lincoln will own all of this, including putting Grant in this position to use this style of warfare that accepts, even embraces the idea of high casualties as the means that will end the war. And part of the reason why Lincoln and Grant are convinced to fight in this fashion is the absolute dogged resistance of Southerners who are now fighting for everything they hold dear. Here again, a lot of the insights that we developed early in the class help us understand why 1864 is this nadir, is this low point in the war, one of the hardest moments in our history. Such brutality, such bloodshed. And that's because Southerners see everything they're fighting for at stake and slipping away. They dig in their heels and they fight to hold on to the Confederacy, secession, slavery, Southern society, slave society. You have the effort of George Tecumseh Sherman, Union general, who from the victory at Vicksburg launches an effort through the Deep South, through the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, from the Mississippi River heading to the Atlantic Ocean. Sherman's famous March to the Sea, which is probably best examined by a novel. We talked earlier about Uncle Tom's Cabin and how fiction can often be more illuminating than nonfiction. Sorry, historians. How novelists, because they have great liberty and latitude, can create a world of texture and vividness that sometimes eludes us historians who are in many ways captive to sources and what can be documented. Yale Doctorow, a great author of historical fiction, author of Ragtime, an interesting treatise on the 1920s, wrote The March, which is a story of this remarkable moment in American history where Sherman is launching this total war. Here's another way in which we could think of the Civil War as total war, or arguably the first modern war. Sherman, from his base at the Mississippi River, launches this full-on assault at the heart of the slave kingdom, the Deep South, marching through the Deep South towards the Atlantic. Wherever he goes, he frees slaves, enforcing now the Emancipation Proclamation. It's no longer just a piece of paper. It is now enforced as the Union takes more and more territory of seceding states and frees enslaved people. He seizes crops to feed his Union soldiers, Sherman does, while destroying crops that could have fed Southerners, intensifying the acute deprivation and starvation facing the South. He destroys farms. He destroys the few railroads that existed in the South, crippling the South, destroying the South, making it now impossible to send resources to, again, a population that's starving. It is absolute total war. And the South, facing this onslaught, digs in their heels because what they're fighting for is their ideal as a slave society. And then in September of 1864, you have the Battle of Atlanta. This again later misrepresented in Gone with the Wind. That burning of Atlanta, total war, total assault on that southern city. So we are in the thickets of total war with all of the brutality, violence, high casualty rates. Again, we're starting to understand why this war would take the lives of more Americans than all other wars in our nation's history combined. When the war now is going so terribly for the South, when it is now occupied by a Northern Army of Liberation, when it must countenance in front of its eyes the end of slavery, the emancipation of people they see as unworthy of freedom, they fight doggedly. And this urges Grant to further his campaign, that this is necessary. The only way to break the back of the South is through this aggressive war of attrition. And you get the nadir of the Civil War, 1864. This moment where the South still, despite its limitations, despite its limited resources, is still fighting to the very end because, again, it's not just fighting for a labor system, not just fighting for slavery as an economic endeavor. It's fighting for its very ideal and rationale that slavery defined. And so as we head towards the election of 1864 in the late summer of that year, it's clear now the North is ascendant. The North is winning, but what a cost. in lives, in tragedy and misery. And total victory, forcing the South into surrender and capitulation, still seems far off because of this dogged determination of Southerners to fight for something that seems to be slipping away. Not just victory, not just a separate sovereign nation, but a slave society that always was the focus of its secessionist movement. And in this context, Lincoln has to run for re-election with all this on his side, on his shoulders. I'm the president that issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm the president who put Grant in this position, and I authorize this effort that likely means the death of your son, your husband. And there's no guarantee this is going to work. What if the South still is able to hold on, and all this is for naught? It's, again, the lowest point of the war, the moment that is most taxing and demanding on both societies, not just armies, where so much is in the balance, and therefore one of the most difficult moments in American history. Lincoln is reelected in 1864 in what I would argue is the most important election in American history. In that year, in that election year of 1864, Lincoln runs for re-election against George McClellan, the Democratic nominee, his old foe, his old rival, adding to the soap opera telenovela aspects of the Civil War. McClellan runs saying, "Elect me and the war ends." He's a peace candidate. Of course, though, that peace comes at a cost. McClellan says the war ends because I'll allow these states to secede. But that means the war ends, no more death. Your son, your husband comes home alive. Now think about the context we've sketched out here regarding the North and how not every Northerner signed on for a war to end slavery, and not every Northerner supports the efforts of Lincoln. So in 1864, you can expect some support for McClellan. He'll lose defiantly, but so much was in the balance, and that's why you can make an argument that the election of 1864 is the most important election, because if things had gone the other way, the United States wouldn't exist as we know it, and slavery wouldn't have ended in 1865. So it's hard to imagine a more fateful election. The entire nation was up for vote. The effort to end slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, and probably now here, was up for referendum. And the country ratified Lincoln. And that meant the war would continue until absolute victory. But what will that look like? And what cost will be paid to achieve that? When the South lost this hope of Lincoln's defeat, when McClellan is defeated defiantly, and when Lincoln reelected would now double down upon his efforts to force capitulation, well, a South that, as we talked about in the previous slide, was already inclined to fight to the bitter end, might be inclined to do so even more intently. In late 1864, the tide of the war had completely shifted. Lincoln's reelection meant this would continue. It was now, at least politically, an imperative to defeat the South, and with the victories of the North, increasingly likely. But how will we get there? And what will that look like? All of this loomed over the nation in the winter of 1864 and 1865. In our next lecture, we'll get you to Appomattox. We'll tell you about the remarkable events that follow Lincoln's reelection, the lead up to his second inaugural, and then that fateful end to the war a few weeks later at the Appomattox Courthouse. So far, we've talked about how we got to such a moment. Troubles with Southern governance, fissures within Southern society, key victories at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and into 1864, Grant's War of Attrition. So we have documented so far the reasons why we are now here in the auspices of victory for the North. But there's still much more war to come. And even with the end of the war, a whole new series of arguments and debates that await this nation.